coming up next. Stay tuned to learn more about the state of the art in blockchain and cryptocurrency technology. Reimagine 2020.
Hi, I'm Steve Albonico. I'm a blockchain consultant for Boeing, and I'm excited to be here for Reimagine 2020.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reimagine 2020. I'm your host, Adam, with an opportunity to get up and close with my guest, Steve Albonico, DevOps engineer from Boeing. Appreciate all of you tuning in right now. We've been going through these interviews for 72 hours straight, so appreciate you. Hopefully, you're enjoying it, every single one of them. Interesting conversation I have today. It's everyone, again, has been watching all these interviews from blockchain companies, influencers, industry professionals, and now we have the chance to speak with someone coming from a non-blockchain company, yet with deep blockchain development experience. So lucky for us. We're all here learning how blockchain is integrating into our personal lives and how much more personal can one get than Boeing. I mean, we fly everywhere, right? So major airline company tapping into blockchain, we'll learn why, along with a whole realm of topics. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce you. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Steve. Name, where you work, title, and we'll kind of kick this thing off.
Right on. Thanks, Adam. So I'm Steve Albonico. I am a blockchain consultant for Boeing right now. I'm contracted with them to make sure that we can get a good production operations going for their blockchain products and help their projects turn to global operation stance. And I'm really excited to be here at the conference. Thank you so much for having me, Adam.
Yeah, awesome. For all, the overall arching goal here, Steve, with this conference was, the world was on fire, everybody, business slowed down globally. Blockchain was still kind of kicking and moving, and we're still clawing, right? We've been through a lot of things. But ideally, the conference was to bring reality and bright minds from not only the crypto space, but the whole blockchain, right? The blockchain industry, whether you're in a traditional company or a blockchain company or somewhere in between, and that could be government. Blockchain is adding value to the ways that we might do business in the future. And, I want to separate the noise from the facts for our audience. And again, thank you for joining us here. So we'll go ahead and kick this off. I've been asking this to all of our guests and panels. What is blockchain to you? And not necessarily in the terms, again, of technical terms of DLT and block size and all that, but what is it to you? The possibilities, is it endless? And so I'd like to get your take on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think to me, blockchain is a new way of looking at data. It's a new way of looking at how we as a group of people, either a private or a public company, can come together with a structure of how is this data going to be managed? Who gets to own this data? What are we going to get to do with this data? We've been in the last 15 years, it's been a big race grabbing all this data, compiling all this data, doing all this work with this data, but we haven't really pushed hard on the ownership ideas of data. Where is this data can work for us? How can we take this data and how can we can attach contract language to it so that a given piece of data you might create on behalf of someone else might create on behalf of you? What does that mean? If you go to a doctor and they create a record for you, we have a lot of things known as HIPAA that come into play as to what those organizations can do with your data, what they need to do if they lose case of your data, anything like that. But what does that mean so far as anything else of the data in your world? And what blockchain really allows, and DLT really allows for, I think, the next generation of data management is to really deep down dive into that governance model of data itself. And when you say data governance models, that's kind of all of a sudden people's eyes glaze over, but it is a big deal when it comes to who we are and what we do, especially in the overarching day-to-day life. When we're on Facebook, or even when you speed through a speed trap and the camera takes your car picture or something like that. that's all data that is eventually going to be tied back to you. And where does that live? Who gets to deal with that? And I think blockchain is picking up a lot of momentum, not even in the public realm, but also in the private realm, because you have a lot of pieces of data that exist with a lot of different owners or in a lot of different users. You have someone who creates a piece of data, but that data then gets shared between organizations, between different places, auditing, things like that. And it matters, like a Carfax. If you take a look at a car, all the different things that have happened to that given car, the mechanic work that's done on it, might have some recalls, things like that. That's a bunch of different data creators and data owners that all tie back to that car. And it's very important to be able to have some sort of record you can trust. But at the same time, a car is a car, but when talking about a human being and a person, how we're able to give someone back the power over that data to be able to see what they have, how we're able for industry to be able to leverage that data in an ethical way, in a way that is okay with the consumers, with the people who are creating that data. I think at the very basic part of DLT, of blockchain, is the idea that you can build this governance through contracts onto the data storage itself, onto the way the data lives. And I think that's kind of the big idea why we're seeing a lot of people feel that there's a big movement towards this. You see a lot, you're seeing a lot of movement around the idea of blockchain. You don't really see, government working task forces for SQL. SQL is a database, it's a type of tool that you use. Blockchain is a tool, DLT is a tool, but it's also a way of looking at data governance and data itself. So that's, to me, blockchain is an ability to really take data and give it that kind of management governance model that can really allow us to take more control over it and use it in better and more efficient and more ethical ways in society.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you bring up some good points, right? We've been having these discussions with various individuals and individuals of companies and blockchain companies. And the reason why I pose that question is because our audience might be going down this rabbit hole. And I think a lot of people hear about blockchain and kind of put that together with Bitcoin, and it's kind of the same thing, but it's really not. Bitcoin's an application on top of it, and what blockchain offers, right, is a wide array of various aspects. It touches all over businesses, and you mentioned data, which is very important, and coming from an enterprise as well, that's super important. And just to kind of dive even further, what's your background? How did you get involved in blockchain? Because I know you've done a few things. You kind of led the way, at your previous kind of employers and stuff. So give us some background on how you got involved in blockchain and how it's kind of led you to where you're at.
Yeah, sure. So for 10 years before I started working here up in Washington with Boeing, I actually ran technology for a police, fire, and 911 department in California. And it was a regional department. It was a department that interacted with 30, 40 different other agencies, federal, state, local agencies. And when you're talking about police and fire, you're talking about people's records that are very important to them. Everything from that parking ticket you got 8 years ago, to a criminal record, to protective orders that keep you safe, to your fire records, medical issues. I was at a park and I stepped on hot coals and it hurt real bad and they had to come help me, to, I had a heart attack, or any of those other things. All of that data is kept in a local database for those responders that help you, but it is also shared. It's shared with the hospitals. It's shared with the owners of the companies that run the medical ambulances or fire trucks that come to help you. All those things take a bunch of different routes of that data. And on top of that, there's auditing departments. We have in California, we had the Department of Justice that would oversee and make sure that a lot of these data ideals were followed, to make sure that this data was safe. But a lot of that data also would be shared for maximum usage. If crime doesn't just stay in one place, medical trends don't just stay in one place, as we know. Viruses don't just stay in one place, and data needs to be shared in order for us to really be able to leverage it. In public safety over the last 10 years, a lot of what we did was trying to establish guidelines, governance that walk that fine line between preserving a person's right to have their data be private and shared only on their terms, versus the society and community's needs to use that data to protect and help and create better services for the public. Where does the rights of an officer stop when it comes to saying, okay, well, I need to know something more about this person we're about to deal with? How much information should a paramedic get when they come to see you, right? Should they be able to see everything about you? And while we really focused on public safety, a lot of our thoughts went very far, even into the distributed identification realm. How do we establish a citizen's identification? And how can we do that in a manner that is both secure for the citizen, but also leverages authority that we can say, you are who you say you are. And right now, at least in the state of the United States, you have driver's licenses is probably the number one way that you would identify yourself. If you want to go to a bar and prove that you're over 18, you give your bartender or you give the guy at the door your whole driver's license. They look at it, they make sure it's not fake, as well as they can, and they let you in or they don't. Now, what you've done here, though, is you've given a lot of information to that bartender. You've not only given them your exact age and date of birth, but you've given them your location where you live on your driver's license, more than likely. You've probably given them your blood type, not that their bartender cares, but it's a lot of interestingly pieces of data that may be on your card that you've given them that you don't necessarily need to give them. All they needed to know is that you were over 18. And so that comes back to some of the work that we did a lot over those last 10 years of how do I keep data on it? How do we keep data as an organization, but also not give it away full tilt? And that comes to the governance models, to the trust models. I think you see a lot of that makes it really hard for true information sharing and usage because you have different stewards, even in the private industry, especially in the private industry. I have a lot of protected data that helps my business cases. I do want to share some parts of it that can help us as a whole, but I want to make sure that I can prove that this data, only the right data gets out and only gets used in the way that I want it to.
And what did you guys use? So you worked on this. What were the options?
Everything from full database scans to a central location where we would just have a sweep where they would just grab all the database records and put them up in a central location, and then everyone would then log into that central location and pull from the records as they needed. That was in the early days. That was really how it was. It was just data scraping and back and forth. And we did have user logs and things like that, which were of course important.
What year? What year was all this going down? Like 2000, like in the 2000s?
Yeah, mid 2000s is about when I got started. And then as we grew, you get APIs, you get different models that go into the sharing and whatnot. But that was still, you're still trusting a middle management system to really handle a lot of these data back and forth calls, right? You can federate your identities. So if you work for a local department, San Francisco, and I work for federal department, DOJ, we can on a basic level trust each other from DOJ to local department, and that's how we can kind of allow some of these data to move. And then based on some of the API rules, we can kind of tweak that a little bit. But at the end of the day, once that piece of data were to leave our agency and transit to your agency or whatever else, you now have ownership as well. And you could transit it somewhere else. You could use it however you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted. And those data models are really hard to enforce. And it's really hard to audit that. If you were to say, hey, a case in point that you could run into is, a criminal justice record. Let's say you're out in the park and you get a ticket because your dog is off leash running around. And you go ahead and you fight that ticket, right? So that ticket's going to start at the park police department, right? But then it's going to transit its way up to the courts, and the courts are going to deal with it then. You may have a public defender. You may have a witness assistant. You may have victim assistance. There's a bunch of different people that are going to involve with that record. You're going to have the State Department overseeing records, making sure that auditing trail, that data is handled correctly. You could have a number of different federal agencies that do any kind of data review, statistic analysis, things like that, crime analysis, whatever else. That's a lot of different places that data can travel. That's a lot of different checks and balances that original person really has no insight into, that original agency may not even have a lot of insights to. And so some of the work that we were really getting into as blockchain kind of rose was the idea of what if we could track the transit of every given piece of data on a distributed ledger. So we would have, it wouldn't be a fully public ledger, right? Because there's a lot of, you have to worry about things when you talk about public ledgers like Ethereum or whatnot. They're great solutions for a lot of different things. But there's always in the back of our minds the things like the DAO incident, the DAO attack, where there was an issue with Ethereum, and basically the community got together, made a decision as a whole that they were going to rewind the clock on some data. And that's an issue, right? Not all of the community agreed with it, and we got a fork out of it.
And we just had them on. We just had ETC on.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
We're hosting some workshops as well. It's kind of interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's kind of interesting. It's just kind of interesting that we all think, as much as we have the internet and databases and all that, that how much everything is still siloed.
Absolutely.
And I got into the game late here. I come from banking, and so you're kind of used to that system, and you see everything and everything you just mentioned, right? Our records are here, and it's hard to go to the doctors or something, and your records are everywhere, and you're kind of the underlying challenges that you're bringing up kind of apply to other areas of industries and verticals. And, I'll let you go on right now, but it's just kind of interesting that, you assume by now that blockchain would have been around, that there is this system, but I guess it comes back down to centralization, right? There's going to end up being one spot, and that's the dilemma. And I think, where blockchain came in is to open that up with an appropriate cryptography and distributed systems and the 3 pillars of security, and all that jazz. So,
right.
I think you were just talking about Ethereum and the fork, and so in this journey, in 10 years working for the city and all that, you guys are trying to figure this thing out, and you had whatever you were working with at that time, these types of databases, and I'm sure they were complicated, but you couldn't quite, it wasn't doing what blockchain could provide now. And so now you're starting to get into, there's options in the blockchain, with blockchain.
Well, at least in my personal experience, which was kind of funny, was in that same time period, right? We were doing a lot of work for criminal investigations and other methods, and as you would imagine, we did come into contact with Bitcoin and the idea of Bitcoin itself. And when we first bumped into it, probably 2013 or 14 was probably when I personally started bumping into it. First, I was like, well, what is this magic internet money? Whatever. But then you're like, well, wait, there's a lot of interesting pieces about this, right? So the first time we bump into Bitcoin, I'm like,
that's exactly what I thought. And you just kind of summed it up too. In 2013, I was at the bank at that time, and then I sent a wire for like $100,000, someone buying Bitcoin. But it didn't dawn on me that concept of what blockchain and Bitcoin was at that time. And I should have known. I should have known then. In hindsight, you do your own due diligence. But the fact that people at that point were already putting 6 figures into it, it was starting to pick up some steam. It had already been out, 4 years, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And there was legitimate uses to it. There's illegitimate uses to it. But for the major part of it, it was not something we really paid a lot of attention to until we had to. Until part of investigations do actually involve trying to trace the record of where money came from, where it went, to try and get pieces of that. Well, Bitcoin is many things, but if you know wallets and you know who has what wallet, Bitcoin is actually remarkably not private. You can go through and explore, and you can trace a whole lot of movement on Bitcoin in public ledgers quite easily.
And that's and people, at that point, even up until now, maybe that narrative, right, of it's drug money and you're trying to hide, you're trying to hide money, but really, it's actually the complete opposite.
No, and that's actually the beauty of blockchain in a lot of regards, is it's trust-based. It is a way of building trust among people who would never have that kind of trust to begin with. Why would 2 completely separate individuals, organizations of any kind, have a central trust? And right now, in the finance realm, and it's not really my my main forte. You trust the government that gives you the currency. So if we live in the United States of America, we trust the Fed that these dollars actually mean something, and we trust that we both will know that this is a real dollar bill and that the federal government will stand behind it. And I'm sure this conference, you've probably gone over that theory a billion times, but the idea of blockchain of Bitcoin was, well, okay, the US government has told us that we can't use dollars to do this. Let's say we're a medical marijuana dispensary, and no banks will service us. Or let's say we are providing services that the US government would do something about if they knew we were doing it. How else do we have some sort of accountability with each other, some sort of distributed ledger that we can all trust? DLT, distributed ledger technology. And so anyways, you start looking at that, and in the back of your mind, 2014, I think to myself, man, that would be great if all of us government agencies could have some sort of distributed ledger that we could have for oversight. What if we could say, Joe Citizen has a ledger, has his own access to that ledger that we can link records to, so that he knows what's out there about him, that he can actually make some sort of informed decision about the things that all these different agencies would know about him. It would be great to know, that this ambulance company has this record on you, that this hospital has this record on you, that your insurance company was forwarded these records, that your criminal record started here, ended here, was purged here. And when someone says, let's say your bank wants to say, hey, I want to know whatever about you. I want to know if you have, I don't know if the bank would ever ask you if you have any criminal convictions, but who knows, maybe they do. You could say yes or no. You could give access. You could be able to give kind of some sort of trusted interrelated data, if that makes sense. Now, we weren't really getting into that piece. We were more interested in the idea of, if my local agency creates data, and I want your local agency to at least know that there's been a string of burglaries in this area, we don't want you to know anything more than that. We don't want you to know who did them, because that's our protected data, and you need to have a need to know these things. We just want you to know, yeah, these burglaries happened like this. These were some pieces to those burglaries that really would be interesting and helpful to compile cross-county, cross-agency data. But we don't need you to know or to be able to run all sorts of interesting stats about those things. We don't want you to be able to pull out from that the home addresses of all the victims, or we don't want you to be able to pull any other kind of stats that could be used against people in a manner that our governance model, that our citizens have put on, that could work. And on top of that, I, as an local agency, am very responsible for your data as a citizen. So if I steward that data, I must make sure that it is used only for the reasons that it needs to be used, set forth for us through our governance model. Basically data rules from your city governments, your local governments, or your state and federal laws. But how do I prove that? If I have a shared database, and that database is connected to a central repository, 40 other agencies can pull in there and get information as they need it. So let's say an officer pulls over a car and runs the person's name. It can search that person across all these different agencies, right? And that officer can pull that data across. He could be from a different agency. How do we make sure that the governance that we have set about, that you shall only use this data for this and for no other reasons, is still enforced? How do we make sure that we are just sharing the data we say? If we have data that's been expunged, if we have data that's for minors that shouldn't be going out to different people, how do we make sure that data is only being accessed the way it is? And if we had some sort of centralized ledger that no one particularly owned, but we were all a part of, that we all had these rights to, that is a huge piece of that puzzle right there. That as more agencies come on board, as more use cases come on board, we can kind of have those come in and use that data, but we can still protect that data. You can have different agencies can have access, different watch groups can.
So right now it's not like that. So right now it's not like that.
No, and it's just like we yell enhance at the screens of TVs all the time, and it doesn't give us the murderer. Believe it or not, our technology is, we have certain pieces of technology, and we have really great pieces of technology that do a lot of data sharing and whatnot, and that they do have logging capabilities. They do have a lot of these different pieces. But in the government, there's a lot of different vendors that serve these different governments, and they each have their own slightly specific databases, slightly specific APIs, slightly specific SDKs.
Yeah.
And it costs money for each one of these things to be done. So if you're a huge city and you want to, you can probably spend the money to connect all these different pieces. And many things have happened. The states do a lot of proactive work to try and get all of this working. But at the end of the day, it's still separate systems, separate vendors. The data itself is actually owned by the system in which it resides. And you either copy it out, you make a call to it, or whatever else. We don't have a centralized ledger that allows this data to really come to a place and then be secured and auditable. And that doesn't mean it's viewable to everyone. It means that it's tracked and it's auditable. And that's kind of the beauty of private ledgers.
I was about to say, I think that's kind of where we're going to lead into. And I think
Right.
the audience kind of tuning in right now, that going back to the intro, right, what blockchain meant to you, and it's a lot of data transfer and custody and like ownership of that data, not only personally, but let's just call it, local agencies, right? Like we can consider them not like people, but everybody has their own access with restrictions, which we'll kind of get into in a little bit on the private side, the private and public blockchain, right? And it seems like that might be a solution. I want to pivot over into kind of what ended up happening. This is kind of your background, right? Leading into Boeing. You just joined Boeing recently, but at the same time, you've had this wealth of knowledge of distributed systems and understanding all these problems that we just went through. And this goes to healthcare and energy and I don't know, all the other verticals, right? Identity and stuff like that. And everybody has issues with managing and controlling that data. So what happened? So you're talking about this whole scheme of problems here, and you guys are getting close, and what you're putting together what you think you need, and I think blockchain is now catching up a little bit. And so what ended up happening, I guess, after you left, after you joined Boeing, or before you joined Boeing, what happened towards the tail end of providing a solution, or they have not touched private blockchains yet? Because it seems like there's a solution.
So to skip ahead to it, there's a lot of interest in it, and that's actually some of the things I do. Is I do give talks to some government data sharing groups and whatnot to kind of talk about, hey, these are the things we could do. And eventually, I did work with a group known as IGES, which is just a national kind of justice technology interface for private and public agencies, and they were working on a really cool white paper that was basically like, man, how could we show some sort of use case that would connect a number of different agencies in the court infrastructure and do something better. And they came up with a really great idea of what's known as protective orders. And hopefully you haven't had to deal with protective orders, but if you have, basically it's something that is created when you feel like you're in danger and you want to keep something else away from you, a person, usually a person. I don't know what else you would keep away from you now, but robots.
Coming.
Something. Yeah, it's coming. But the protective order process is a complicated process because it touches many, many different agencies, from the judge itself, the judge themselves, to the clerk that actually does a lot of the paperwork, to the agencies that have to serve it and then enforce it, to the victim assistance groups, to lawyers that have to see this kind of stuff. It's a huge amount of different people that have to be in play with each other. And it also needs to be cross-referenced by a whole bunch of other courts. So what we did was we built, I took a look at their white paper, and I was like, this is a great way to start a Hyperledger, to start to really dive into Hyperledger. So Hyperledger Fabric is built by the Linux Foundation with a lot of support from a number of other groups. IBM is a big supporter. And the thing about Hyperledger is it's very extensible. You can pretty much tweak it any way you need it to tweak. And it's very easy to jump into because it basically, you click 4 or 5 scripts and it pops up a Docker instance with a couple running nodes, and away you go. You slap a API on top of it and then a UI on top of that. You got yourself a blockchain. Why not? It's all self-signed certificates. So, it's a great proof of concept. So what we did was we slapped one of those together on Amazon, the cheapest Amazon cluster I possibly could. My thought was, well, if this runs, cool, whatever. So we put that together. We called it, called it Justice Fabric. And we basically built this easy little use case where the judge creates a protective order, the clerk certifies it, the officer serves it. But here's the cool part about it, and lawyers can take a look at it, even the public could take a look at this because the public does have rights to this data. But depending on the certificate you're given, so, right, the way this works, right, is that each of these different organizations can basically create certificates, and within those certificates, they can give different access rules within the chain code. So if you are from organization A, and that organization has said, okay, well, you're an officer, you have rights to see everything, right? So you make a request to the chain code checks your cert and says, oh, well, based on your cert that you were given, I can show you all of this. And that's not happening at the UI level. That's not happening at the API level. That's not happening at any other level but the data level itself. And that's a huge deal. And yes, that is theoretically done elsewhere. You can do that in other places. But you're combining that with the consensus method, the consensus that you have on top of that. You're combining that with a governance model that you can build into it. That's a lot of this is open source. So you can take a look at what other people are doing and build around it. And it's quick. So you can go ahead and the judge can create that, and it's as soon as he creates that, that's on the ledger. The clerk goes and certifies it. That's on the ledger. Now every agency that's part of that ledger sees it. There is no waiting for pushes and pulls, for databases to connect to each other, for any of that kind of stuff. The moment that happens, that's on the ledger. An officer can see that, can interact with that. An officer can see all the data. A member of the public who has a public cert, nothing more, could basically only see that a protective order has been issued in this area. A public defender can see that, okay, my client has this PO has become active. They can now say that they are protected under this protective order. That process can take a long time when it's paper or database to database, serving methods, anything like that. This proof of concept needs a lot of work to it, right? It needs to actually go live. It needs to actually be picked up. But in theory, it can take a process that can take hours, days, into seconds. And when it comes to protective orders, you probably need that protection now, not later. So every minute that we can shave off of that is a minute that we could help save somebody, or at least give someone that protection, that peace of mind. And so that was really cool. So to take a step back, I got into that and working on that. The actual reason I got into doing that spending enough time with that is I moved from California to sunny Washington State. It's a joke. It's raining.
Yeah, no.
It rains like 90% of the time, but it's beautiful and I love it up here. Moving up here, what do you do when you're an unemployed technology person? You build stuff. You find things to go build stuff for. And that was something that's always been on my mind. And I wanted to find a use case. And so that was the use case. Built that out, was very happy. We said, hey, this looks really good. Let's start shopping it around. Huh? I did it. Well,
was there a lot of support for this?
No, there's a lot of interest. Support would mean someone gave me money to do it. No one gave me money to do it. This was me. When you want to learn a new technology, when you want to get good at something, go find a need in the community and fill it using that technology.
And I think I want to tie that into our viewers here. It's kind of a lesson learned, right? Like, there's a lot of developers right now watching, checking out this conference, and then we're talking to all these technologists and different, degrees of technology, from BD, business development, to developer, to, marketing and then concept. But I think understanding, and I think this might be an issue across the board, even in the blockchain space, that, everybody's trying to understand it, is that blockchain is not a one size fit all. It's not going to cure the world's problems and all that. But this is a perfect example of understanding the problem and then kind of just using what tools are available, as opposed to maybe, certain, even enterprises right now, trying to plug in blockchain where it's not really a solution. They're just, I don't know if it's marketing or, obviously there's education that's involved that you can't just plug it into. But this is, for the students watching, and then tying that into your development, actually practicing hands-on coding and doing that is a perfect use case. And even to tie it further, blockchain's purpose is trust, right? You were trying to find trust amongst local agencies and then the employees within that. Not only that, I mean, now you're bridging that into the public, sector of individuals and citizens. So now, there's no trust there amongst, right off the bat, right? There's got to be this database, and this is kind of what ties into blockchain. And I want to pivot into how this led into you going to Boeing, really, because I think you took that hands-on of a problem. You found the solution on your own, which is great for students watching this and even other people in the middle of the pack trying to conceptualize what how blockchain plays into daily operations. And I think people looking for careers, right, this is a good opportunity where you don't really have to be a coder, but you have to understand like how you're working with what the problem is, and then how you're going to solve it with kind of the technology, as opposed to I know how to build things and then I'm just going to plug it into the whatever I think where it fits, square peg in a round hole. So this kind of propels you, I guess, even on your resume to now go to Boeing. And what happens in that transition where now, what was the motivation for Boeing? And had they already had a program and you kind of just came in to provide even more support and knowledge?
So yeah, absolutely. Boeing is Boeing. So Boeing has a program. They've been working blockchain for a while. They've been working on a number of projects in the blockchain sphere internally, and they just saw that I was doing this on LinkedIn. So I just threw it up on my LinkedIn. Hey, this is a project I'm working on. This is something really cool. And I was about to go start knocking on doors and saying, hey, I'm up here in Seattle. Anyone want to give me a job? And they found me first. They said, one of their now, as I said, I'm a contractor, a consultant for them. One of their contracting companies that gives them a lot of technical expertise reached out and said, hey, Hyperledger Fabric, Enterprise? I said, yep, absolutely. And they said, let's have a chat. And so we had a chat. And I'm not a traditional developer, right? My degree is in criminal justice. I'm at best a manager when it comes to a lot of these things. When you have to manage a lot of
that's even a lesson learned right there. It's like, it doesn't matter what it's on paper. It's kind of you had this thought process to break down a problem and really identify the pain points and leverage what you had to make something better. And I think that kind of, and you just mentioned your degree wasn't even in coding. So there might be some, individuals right now trying to fit, same boat of not having a job. And I think the lesson learned is really applying applicable skill sets, understanding problems, and then not necessarily completely coding, but you used what you had and you leveraged it, and then it provided a POC, and that's how it all starts. And now it propelled you to what you're doing now. Now I'm assuming they just, like you said, they saw what you did and they're working on something, and that's what the blockchain space needs, is understanding, listening, and it's a community thing, right? To apply this technology, because it's so brand new.
Right. Well, and in the tech sphere, there's such a huge spectrum of what every solution needs. And it truly, the hardest part about this industry, and it's always been, is you walk into it and there will always be some technology you kind of understand but don't really, and somebody totally understands it, and your imposter syndrome kicks in and you're like, I don't know anything, and I'm scared. I don't even want to ask a question because I don't even want them to know what I'm worried about. But it truly is, when you are trying to understand solutions, when you're trying to understand new technologies like blockchain, like any of this stuff, AI, whatever else, find a problem and then walk yourself back from it. If this is something that matters to me in my community, in my sphere of whatever it is that I'm working on, what could help that? I've heard of this cool new technology. I feel like this could possibly work with it. And in my case, it was data sharing, and it was the public sphere. And I kind of walked that back and I built that. And I realized that, like, okay, well, we have a great proof of concept. We have an interest. The governments are interested in it, but they're not ready to support it yet. They're not really ready to throw a lot of money and support it, but I think they're getting there. And we can talk a little bit more later about the different working groups you're seeing. California stood one up. Washington is almost there. So there is a lot of interest in the government when it comes to blockchain solutions in general. But there's a lot of steps we need to go through to make sure that this is the proper solution. But when you get into large enterprise has the same amount of needs just as well. They have a lot of data that needs to be shared efficiently, but still needs to be trustful. And data provenance is a word you'll hear a lot. When any industry that has a large support chain to it, a large supply chain and the support of that. When you have a number of different sub-industries, a number of different sub-providers that all come together to create something, the planes don't just pop out of nowhere. There's a huge long tail of where these parts are coming from throughout the world. And it's a very intricate dance of these different pieces and where they're going and how good these pieces are and all these different parts that come into play. Even within a big company, there is going to be silos. You can't be huge without having different specialties pop up, create their infrastructure, and then have to play with the other parts of it.
You probably hear it all the time too. That you talk to friends and family, and you call within your employer like, "Hey, I'm trying to get this information. Oh, we don't do that here. You're gonna have to go over here. I can't see that. Some firewalls there. So it's kind of interesting. And as you mentioned, I think the enterprise and then the government kind of hierarchy of levels of info, data, access management, data management. I'm assuming Boeing was no different as far as it being siloed.
No, and it's not any of this is bad or anti-technology or anything like that. That's just how these things work. Any large enterprise data system is going to have these things, and it's always going to be trying to make it more efficient, trying to make it better. And so, enterprise blockchain is a little bit more boring than the idea of public blockchain and specifically financial blockchain. Really, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of cool stuff in it, but it is just as important for adoption in a lot of regards. And it may be true in my thoughts that you asked really early on, how does grandma interact with blockchain? My thought is, I don't know that most grandmas are going to have a digital wallet where they keep their Bitcoin and their Ripple and everything else. Some will, and those are going to be awesome grandmas when they take off their VR helmet and they check their Bitcoin. But I think for the most part, grandma's going to interact with it by the fact of she's going to log into a UI somewhere, maybe on the web, and it's going to give her a whole lot more information that's going to help her apply for something, for medicine, for assistance, for something else, or the person that's going to be helping her shepherd it through is going to really benefit from the idea that, okay, well, I have grandma's access token, however we present the certificate that grandma has that gives me access to her medical records across the entire spectrum of whatever I'm looking at, right? If we can pull off a distributed ledger, a trustable distributed ledger, private, maybe it could have public pieces to it. And that's also a really interesting thing to get into, is how there can be a blend of public and private.
Yeah, a hybrid model of private and pushing data on chain pieces, because obviously there's some cost restrictions there that apply. Absolutely.
And that is a thing you're going to keep coming back to, is when it comes to local government, is there's always a cost restriction, unfortunately. Quality, time, cost, pick two. And many times it's not going to be cost when you come to very small government, really small needs. But I think to kind of finish that Boeing thought, the thought of grandma and whatever else, is those efficiencies add up very quickly. When you're able to tie together a number of different data silos, and so that someone can do a really quick check on something, you can build value out of something that would normally not have a ton of value. Take a case in point, you have two cars you're trying to sell. One has a complete, I don't know why I keep saying Carfax, I'm sure there's a lot of competitors, but I guess it's the Coke of this. One has a full-on Carfax. I can see everything you've ever done to it, all these different checks. The other one has like, okay, well, I have one record here from when I went in for a recall thing, and I got this other record when I got hit by a car. Same car, right? Same exact car. Which one's more valuable? The one with the full record from a trustable source.
Yeah.
And you haven't actually done anything to that car, but what you have done is you've given trust and provenance, data provenance to that, and that is where you can across enterprises. That's the value piece that can be built on these things. Another piece of that is also just governance in general. To be able to have a number of different players at a table say, this is how I want this data to be used, that builds value as well.
And I think to tie into the data, the governance, and then the trusted model, the provenance as well. And, everybody that's watching, the blockchain, I feel, it's just another layer for devices, IoT, right? AI, ML, This is going to help maneuver that. And going back to your governance and even your POC, right, with your previous employer, it's like it's leading the way, and this blockchain is actually at the beginning of all this stuff, and it's going to tie into, again, like, so obviously supply chain and then all of the sensors and IoT hardware, and it comes back down to trust, and then it comes back down to governance on who's managing it, because it's decentralized in a way, so you got to make sure that especially for enterprise, and I guess especially for the public side too, it has to be controlled. It can't be leaked. For sure encryption to make sure that none of that. And so, what kind of? Because I want to get into the question of moving from POCs to actual production, which you might have some insight there. But what kind of projects was Boeing doing? Whatever's public, I didn't have to get new nitty gritty, but I really want the viewers to understand again that you went from the public side of understanding all these problems to plugging in blockchain. Now you're at Boeing, kind of similar, underlying issues. And what kind of POCs were drawn up? Was it a bunch of POCs? Just one?
So yeah, I obviously can't really speak to specifics, Sally, but what I can talk about is I can talk about the idea path. Boeing is like most enterprises, like most governments, is that you have an idea path, and that idea has to go through a number of different gates to grow itself to a place of value, right? So the biggest question you
I can't hear you.
Oh, can't hear me at all?
Now I can.
Okay, cool. Let me take 2 steps back. The biggest
you're talking about the path, to drive value.
Right. So yeah, the question is how do you get from a POC to a global production piece? And the answer is, like anywhere else, you have to have an idea that still keeps working even when you start piling on the overhead to run that given idea, right? You have to make sure that that idea, when you're going to get some very smart people that are going to come to you and say, why blockchain? What is it about this piece of blockchain that you can do that is more efficient that you couldn't do with any other given piece? And the answer has to continually be, well, it's more secure in this manner, or it's at least as secure, and now it's more secure in this manner. It's more efficient. It allows us to bake more into whatever it is we're doing. So case in point, one thing I can talk about, why wouldn't we just have a bunch of SQL databases with open APIs across each other for the core system of that POC I created? Well, because when you get to the real world, those things take time, money, and effort, and they don't always sync up, and it doesn't work super well. But look at this. We built a POC, and look how well this works in a real world situation. It's working right now. We have it running in just a little Docker infrastructure, and that's when people sit up and they say, oh, I can see a thing, and I can see how this would be great. Now, put it in Kubernetes, make it enterprise, give it global high availability, get an operations team behind it, build a CI/CD pipeline that can feed it correctly, and then you're like, oh,
there we go.
Oh, that's a lot of overhead, right? I mean, it's that jump, right? It's that piece that you have to make sure that your original POC was strong and valuable enough that when you get to those other questions, are we going to cut our own certificates? Where are the certificates going to come from? Who are the governance managers going to be? Who's going to be an organization? What are they going to bring to the table? Governance is a huge piece. It is a long meeting field piece of talking meetings for meetings, but that is the piece that builds the ultimate governance model that the chain code then puts into real action. And that's where the value comes from. You have the technical standpoint of it, but you also have that value add.
And so would you say that Boeing has fully accepted it?
Ooh, I will say this.
It's not going to go across maybe the whole company, but
right.
I mean,
I can speak from my experience, which is just one. I think there's 160,000 people at Boeing, but from my experience, this is a rough time to be in any industry, particularly building airplanes. The fact that as of right now, mid-May 2020, Boeing is still very much working on blockchain projects, very, very much interested in it.
For now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's how I look at it. That's what gives me faith that I made the right career jump. You know, when I moved up here, you know, the question was, pick something that you think is really going to bring value, that's going to allow you to help things along, whether it be with the Boeings of the world, whether it be with small government, whether it be with nonprofits, whatever it is. Find a technology that can help people learn it and then bring it to fruition. And I think everything I've seen at Boeing, I think I made a good choice.
And to tie that up, even with the cloud, right? Nobody wanted to move from their centralized servers on premise to the cloud, and there was some concern there. And I was just having this conversation yesterday with another interviewer, and it brings up good points for students right now, or anybody kind of looking for jobs, that this, it's a perfect opportunity to maybe jump into blockchain for some of the reasons of, first of all, we're in a pandemic, right? And blockchain's actually gone through major ups and downs in the last, since maybe Bitcoin came out, or maybe 2013 or 2014 when Ethereum came out, and it provided other features that everybody's, tagging along. And I think even it seems a long time since blockchain is here. Obviously, the components of blockchain have been here for decades. This type of concept is maybe things are all coming together. And it seems like, it's a good time or I was talking about the cloud and people, that maybe jumped in at that point, are probably better off now, having jumped on that boat. And this might be the same kind of mentality that people should take as blockchain is here. Enterprises are taking a look at it, actually using it. And I also want to ask, in general, the private and the public chains, I'm assuming you guys might be using Fabric or maybe some custom chain. What are your thoughts on integrating, a public blockchain, I guess? Because it goes from a DLT to, it's kind of the same thing, but, permission to permissionless. Are those discussions being had, or they're not really concerned about it being private or public, more concerned about the governance and security, but more efficiency, however that works?
There's huge talk everywhere. The question is, what can a public-based consensus model do that a private can't, and what can a private do that a public can't? Now, the real question is always going to be, if you're a deep enterprise, if you're working on deep enterprise stuff, what does going public really mean? Like, how does that really help outside of just making your security team really nervous all the time, which is in and of itself always fun. But for certain use cases, obviously one is better than the other, and for certain cases one is better. The interesting part is where you get into that blended piece, right? But let's say maybe you have a large pandemic, or maybe you have an issue where you want to make sure that you want to get people that may be kind of nervous to use a product assured that this product is as good as it could possibly be. It's been tested, the pilots have been tested, everyone's been tested. How can we prove all these different things? If we had some sort of public model where we could show just enough data to prove, hey, you know what? This person has been tested for the given COVID-19 or whatever, and this is a passport to prove to you that they were cleared, they had it, they don't have it anymore, they're no longer contagious. This plane has gone through every security concern you could ever need, right? It is as secure as you could possibly imagine. That's an interface, right? You have a lot of private data that needs to be captured and maintained on that piece, but you also want to have a public piece of it that people can take with them, that they can use, that they can have. And, is it blockchain's time to shine for COVID-19 doing some sort of way for people to be able to test themselves or show that they've been tested, that they are safe, that they are ready to interact? Perhaps. That is definitely a use case. I'm sure there are people that are working on it.
I think IBM just launched a COVID consortium, really. And I think you can use it for free for a period of time, of course. But it looks like they're providing some kind of technical support in that realm of applying DLT blockchain to identify, virus outbreaks and probably supplies. So it's kind of interesting you bring that up.
Right. And it's interesting, right? So that's the private side of it. The private side is medical records with a little bit of public passport idealism. But the public piece here is contact tracing. How do we combine that with the individual and the public's ability to trace back where individuals have been and whether or not they've come in contact with other pieces? And that's a huge piece that you're seeing a lot of question marks coming into. They're building these huge teams to do contact tracing. All right, okay, now we can confirm that this person does in fact have the virus. How can we go back and try and see where that hotspot started from, or who other people that need to be warned first? How do we walk that line of public-private interface where we still want to keep the majority of what you do, your records, just from walking around in a given day, right? Your phone itself, cameras all over the place, public cameras, private cameras, they all have something to do with what you've done in a day. And if it can help contact tracing, if it can help to keep people safe, to make one less person that could die from COVID-19 not actually get it in the first place, that's a huge win. But how do we balance that, and how do we provably balance that protection so that you aren't just giving all of your personal information, where you're going? I mean, a person's daily activities is actually very, very meaningful data about who you are, what you do. Even the fact that, it looks like Steve always goes to Safeway Sunday nights from 7 to 8 p.m. and he always buys some Oreos. Like, always. That's a lot of really personal information about someone. We don't need all of that, but we may need some of that to help others. And where can we draw that line? How could we give the average person the ability to have that switch on their phone or on their digital device that says, okay, give this amount of information and make it private and anonymous until specifically someone who we trust and we give authorized to gets to see a little bit more to make sure that I didn't get exposed or that I didn't expose someone else. How can we do that? That is a huge leverage point where you could see what we're talking about, private public chain interface.
And with your employer now, going back to this private and public kind of concept of not only the chain, but the use cases within the private sector and then the use cases within the public sector. Is Boeing using the technology internally only with Boeing, or does Boeing also leverage the technology to bring in suppliers and vendors and everybody else?
I think that for the most part, it's an ecosystem. They're working towards ecosystem stuff. I mean, absolutely, there's a lot of internal stuff that could be used, but I think the beauty of chains in general is they can grow, and I think you're going to see that.
And is that ecosystem pretty receptive and accepting?
Yeah, I think it is.
They see the benefit.
I think every enterprise group that I've talked to, they've never said, no blockchain, I don't like it, it doesn't sound like it's useful to me. Everyone has always said, this sounds really good, I don't quite understand it yet.
Yeah.
How's this going to work, and what does that mean for me? And depending on the person you talk to, it can even be like, well, a bunch of technical questions. How's it going to scale? How much memory? How much hard drive am I going to use? Is it going to blow me up when is my ledger going to become 8,000 terabytes large after?
And that's kind of another question I have is the technology where we're at today. Is your team kind of satisfied? Obviously, technology will continue to grow and get better, but are we matching the applications with the the technology that we have today? Is it satisfying for a POC requirement, or even is it the technology even ready for production?
Well, I personally think it is. I think we're at a place now where I think Hyperledger, Fabric itself, I think Ethereum, I think a lot of these different large scale chains, they can work. You're seeing a huge amount of usage of them. I mean, IBM is really deep working with Hyperledger, and they're seeing a lot of success for it. I personally think it works really well.
Why do you think there's still? I think people are trying to identify which technology works, but how does that come into play? Why doesn't everybody just use Hyperledger?
Why doesn't everyone just use JavaScript? Like, why doesn't everyone just use Java? Like, I mean, that's a great question. That's a very good question. Yeah, well, preference, use case. Even within the Hyperledger world, there's like
Sawtooth and Fabric and
there's a ton. There's even one where it has a virtual machine of Ethereum inside of it. Talk about public-private interface. Like, we're gonna run a little bit of Ethereum, but we're gonna make it private. Yeah. It's like you have your own internal virtual machine, and then I think you're seeing, I think that's an interesting concept of why this one, why that one. And it does come down to, like anything else, is in the ecosystem support. I personally find that Hyperledger Fabric is pretty mature as far as these things go. And how do you really say that? How many blockchains have we really dealt with? What does maturity really mean?
Because I think the success rate is really low. I think there's been tons of POCs on that. I don't want to drop names, but yeah, using that kind of technology, I feel like the success rate, or I've heard and I've seen that it's pretty low. A lot of use cases, or a lot of attempts, a lot of POCs. But I think going even back to your introduction, right, of how you applied it with your previous employer, and you're bringing that kind of mentality now with Boeing and managing projects where maybe it was just too early because there was tons of projects that just failed and blew up and whatnot. Small success.
Well, I mean, it is actively in development. The idea of distributed ledger technology is an actively developed idea, and progress is not a straight line. It is never a straight line, and it is absolutely, there will absolutely be issues that will pop up where everyone's gonna be like, oh boy, not quite sure what to do with this right now, and those will have to be dealt with, and
kind of like you don't want to be it's kind of like you don't want to be the first one out, and then last one to join, right? You kind of want to be somewhere in the middle of the pack where you kind of learning from everybody's mistakes, at the same time not coming in too late where your market share has already been taken up.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even just look at the evolution of the tool sets for Ethereum. Yeah. I mean, what, 4 years ago, what really was there? What was out there? And now, you have the Truffle suite is awesome. Like, you have all sorts of cool tool sets and a real development environments that you can really build and do whatever with. Keep moving, as we keep moving forward with that, Hyperledger Fabric just released 2.1, which is a huge leap from 1.4, which is where most people who got into Hyperledger really started to kind of get it, like, oh, I see how this could really work. And they're still working out a lot of stuff. They've made a transition in the consensus ordering system that they've from a Kafka-like communication structure to a Raft. And there's a lot of different things, and you look at that and you're like, oh yeah, that's way better. I mean, the old way would have worked, but the new way is better. And I think you're going to continue to see that. You're going to see this growth.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think, are you following any other projects?
Following, yeah, a ton. I think some of the ones that are really interesting to me, Hedera Hashgraph, I think they're doing a lot of interesting work. Now they're working really hard towards the consensus model, getting a lot of governance people on board, where the consensus is run by trusted people up front. And we're going to build this thing from the bottom up. It is going to have public pieces to it, but it's definitely going to be trustable. You can trust the nodes on it to be large certified companies, things like that.
And going back to the trust or the model and the consensus, actually, is there such, to what degree is decentralization and centralization, how many nodes? Are you kind of the believer of, certain aspects are going to be distributed or decentralized, and there's, certain parts are going to be centralized? I feel like people are like, oh, that's not decentralized enough. And then others are,
Well, yeah, that is an absolute reality. Is there are people that look at this and say, if there is any centralization, the whole thing is blown up.
Yeah.
And no way. I love the idea. I would love to believe so fully in a given concept. And I think that there are specific situations where absolutely, like, you want this thing to be completely of the people, for the people, completely anonymous, no overarching governance model, sure, and whatever else. But I think even within the more buttoned up world of enterprise, you are going to see a lot more loosening of that single leader of data. You're going to see, and I think we've been seeing this a lot in open source work, where you have someone who may be championing a given chain or implementation at this point, but are highly invested in making sure it's an ecosystem, a combined effort, a board, if you will, of different groups. And that's actually one of the cool parts about distributed ledgers, and even the private ones, is The chain code itself, the actual part where your governance model meets the rubber meets the road, that is voted on by all the different members. So you could be the guy who wrote, you could be the company that wrote all of this, and you could have a large amount of sway. You could have, if you're running 4 out of 10 nodes or 4,000 out of 10,000 nodes, you have a lot of sway. You have 4 votes towards it. But if all 6 other votes say, I don't like it, the chain code doesn't get deployed. And I'm making it very simple, but it really pushes a decentralized model to a very buttoned up situation where these groups can now collaborate on governance models, on code, on whatever else, and they can have a decentralized model of, I want this, no, I don't want that, but between organizations, and that's a huge deal.
But do you think that's going to slow down, like what kind of other, I guess we can't solve it all, but I feel like there's just going to be other problems there of coming to a decision, right? And I think it's going to take some time for this evolution. And I guess there's going to be more experienced players within that realm of nodes or validators or,
Well, absolutely. Have you ever seen a Wikipedia fight break out? Like, decentralized always, nothing comes for free, right? There's always going to be an issue with it. Like, you decentralize too far and nothing gets done because everybody's always arguing over minutia. Like, that's an absolute possibility. If you don't set the governance model up correct in the first place, chaos.
How many? Right. The percentage of enterprises you think? Is this technology going to touch most enterprises?
I think it should.
It should.
I think, at least in my experience, there is an efficiency gap that will provide value.
And then is that going to drive down cost and efficiency and transparency to identify, where things are? I guess I'm kind of talking supply chain, but in general, even paperwork, right? And I still know banks are using fax machines, but obviously they're touching in a blockchain as well, like R3 Corda, like quorums.
Oh yeah, totally. And those RC Cora and Cora, absolutely other very interesting pieces, right? How they have their different consensus models set up. But like you said, trying to get my dog's records from California to Washington, right? Fax records and hope is all that there is there, right? But the same idea applies. Is there's still a lot of different efficiency gaps that exist that can be filled specifically from a distributed nature, a ledger in general. Is it going to be Hyperledger Fabric in 5 years? Maybe. Is the theory going to still be there? Oh, I am 100% sure that the theory of distributed data management and distributed identification management and the intersection of that is absolutely going to take off. It is.
Real quick, and I kind of brought it up earlier. Are there discussions where right now we're talking about kind of data, data management and governance and all that? Is there talk that this infrastructure is going to help again with devices and IoT and middleware?
Oh yes, 100%. I didn't really touch on it, but absolutely, when you have a lot of automated data, specifically dealing with what you do with that, if you could hit thresholds with it. Let's say you have an IoT device that is measuring something, anything, right? And you want to put in a standard that if you hit 60% of negative, I want to cut it off. This thing is no longer worthwhile. And I want to tie that into a whole other logic pool. I want to be able to tweak that on the fly. I want to have machine learning take a look at these contracts and what's going on here and maybe tweak that chain code back and forth to kind of efficiency derive with the data you're getting from the IoT. You really could have a cross-chain logic piece that's all completely encapsulated in that. Would it burn out and blow up? Maybe. But it could very well bring a huge amount of efficiency if you're using IoT to take continuous measurements that are trustable across different.
And I assume Boeing is. I assume with airplanes and parts and supply chain and again devices on mechanical stuff, I'm sure the blockchain could be a pivotal solution, critical next step.
Yeah, it could be huge. It could be a huge piece.
And I think the next step would be is obviously these chains are going to get better, and we still don't know, who's going to make it out. But we can use what we have now, like the Hederas and the Stellars of the world, and the Fabrics of the world. No, I mean, this has been great insight. I think we're going to be coming up on time soon, but I mean, we could talk here for a long time. I kind of want to jump into, education and adoption, right? And so your education was really hands-on and work experience, previously, carrying that over. And for the viewers out there, I've asked this to a lot of my interview guests of like education. MouseBelt has a large program that we provide resources to 80 plus schools to kick up innovation and provide support, whether it's a startup or research grants and all that development efforts. And I posed this question the other day with like, there's no blockchain courses, right? And so I was like, do we even need blockchain in it? We sponsored UCLA's first accredited course, but I was thinking, like, do you just need YouTube and a computer science background? You don't even have a computer science background, but you understand it. And that's kind of one aspect of education, meaning formal education, and then education of our family's understanding. Maybe on the there's one aspect of currencies, but then there's one aspect of the underlying tech, and we just talked about it for the last hour of how it's being used. What are your thoughts on that? And I want to tie that into kind of the nonprofit, which I think is a great idea. But before we get there, the formal education and then kind of just learning on the fly.
So formal education is very good. Let's throw that out here right first. A CS degree is a great thing to get. Go get it if you can. If you can afford it and it's something that can work for you, it's fantastic. I was moving towards CS. 9/11 happened to happen while I was going to college. I decided I wanted to go to criminal justice, but I was always a technologist at heart. So the moment I got into a police department, I hacked a phone for a thing they needed, and they're like, "You're not a cop. You're a tech guy." Yeah. But there is such a broad industry now when it comes to technology. There is such a broad need space for technology, and for those who are able to afford and the opportunity cost of 4 years to go get that computer science degree, that's amazing, because it teaches you, a lot of what it teaches you is how to think, how to think in a technical manner, how to apply the methods that we know work really well to understand the math, the coding, the loops, all that kind of good stuff. And I'm really generalizing this. But for many people, that's not quite in reach for them. You've been in a career, you've had parts of your life that meant that you didn't have that opportunity to spend that time only focusing on the specifics. And you're seeing with the rise of coding boot camps and whatever else, there's a rush to try and meet that need in the middle. And especially now, I mean, with this, the entire world feels like it's kind of turned upside down. We're all sitting at home, wondering what we can do. One of the things that always interested me is that if you want to learn something, you don't have to understand it inside out. You just have to go and try it. Yeah. Let it fail a number of times, break it a bunch of times. And for me, it's funny, you were like, well, how did you learn Hyperledger Fabric? The first step for me was UC Berkeley has a blockchain group, and they put on a number of YouTube courses that were fantastic. They were fantastic. They didn't teach me the minutia. They didn't teach me how to build a consensus model. They didn't teach me that. But what they taught me was just enough to get you going. Hey, these are the things you need to know. And then you can really dive into the docs, the documentation. Every technology has docs, has training arenas, has specific little pieces that you can actually take, try to get them working and break them. And it's kind of a great question of where does those two places meet? Where does the traditional educational model of the path, here is a path you follow, and when you're done with it, you will know blockchain, to okay, but what actually is the best way of doing blockchain right now? Yeah. Like you could probably put me and 3 other people in a room, and we would probably argue for 4 hours as to what's the right way to do consensus. And if you're trying to learn from that model, you're going to have a lot of theories, you're going to have a lot of ideas, but until you go out there and actually download the source code from Hyperledger's GitHub and mess with it and throw it up on an AWS and wonder why all of a sudden all the RAM is gone, there's a lot of really cool little pieces to that. And you don't necessarily need a 4-year degree to do that. But what you do need is you need to have, and this is my personal thing, I think you need to have a passion outside the tech itself. I think you need to have some idea of like, this is something that I want to fix, or I want to help, or I want to make better. I mean, some people work really well on the idea of like, I just want to make a lot of money. And sure, great, excellent. Find a technology that works for you and build a bunch of random stuff out of it, and find a company that wants to pay you a bunch of money to do it.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of us, for me, it was, I really wanted to help out with public data and figure out better ways to do it. And I think, I jumped across a lot of different learning avenues to do it. And that worked out really well for me. And I think this kind of dovetails a little bit into the nonprofit idea, a bit of it too. But like, for me, I basically was like, it's time to start knocking on doors and seeing, talking to my contacts and seeing who has a problem that they need to solve that I could possibly solve with this new technology I found, right? And that's the hardest part, right? Is finding that problem that needs to be solved, and finding someone who's willing to support you as you do it, as you learn, and finding a mentor or finding someone who's done it before that can kind of teach you those basic patterns of no. You're definitely not going to take a self-signed cert into production. Like, lots of interesting little pieces there, right? That you have to have that group of people, and it's getting that junior dev idea, that junior role that you can go and learn from the best. And no matter how much experience you have in this industry, you will always find people who are going to be willing to help you and give you that little extra knowledge bump. And because there's so much more you're going to learn, not from school, not from the documentation, from the actual building it and working with someone else who can look at it and be like, oh, I already did that once. Watch out for that.
And I think that's where blockchain obviously has an impact on all of us, right? Going to meetups, meeting up, hackathons. We're doing a hackathon here with the conference next week. So much camaraderie, collaborative effort, open dialogue, right? And I think that translates or transfers into problem solving kind of, wherever you're working, right? And I think no matter what position you are, in the blockchain space, it touches so many things of economics, psychology, game theory, business acumen, right, and understanding, and that, and putting all that together, and it requires kind of a team. And one thing that we identified early on was, and I think we're in good hands moving forward, going back to maybe that ambition or that inspiration of identifying a problem and trying to solve it, was why we kicked off our university program. Really was because we saw all these students like super engaged and enthusiastic about blockchain and going back to, there was no courses back then, right? These are just kind of coming out. I think UC Berkeley might have been, MIT's of course, and Stanford's might have been moving along, further along than many of the other schools. But we saw that passion to build cool stuff, and that's what made us really provide as much resources and support as possible, which is, helping them throw their meetup parties and sponsoring hackathons and giving away prizes, because at the core of what we do, same thing. We would just want to build cool shit. Like, we just want to help put out product, ship stuff out. And even during this kind of crazy ICO, fiasco back in the day, that was kind of a cool funding mechanism, but really nothing got shipped, right? And it kind of changed that narrative. But now here we are. That kind of got weeded out, and now here we are where it's penetrating enterprises. There's actually chains out there, people putting out, informative stuff. Research is coming around, and so you bring up very many good points, which kind of leads into what an idea that community development and open source stuff, and for the viewers out there, give them some insight into this nonprofit of, I guess, hands-on approach, and it's really not formal, but blockchain as of right now, it's growing at the university, so their courses are coming in. We just sponsored the course, to their first course at UCLA last year. We're doing it again, but it's a hands-on thing, and I think what you're doing, what you were telling me about it is pretty cool. So we kind of want to touch on that. We got a few more minutes, about 5 minutes.
Awesome. Yeah, no. So everyone has a passion project. You should always have some passion that you have in the back of your mind that you always want to go for. And for me, it's this nonprofit idea. And obviously global events have kind of slowed down all things, including this idea. But working in the public industry, the public sector, there are so many smart, really good people that are looking for something, that are looking to build something, to really get that experience, to get that idea built and done, and they don't have the technical chops, or they're just fresh out of school or boot camp or whatever else, and they're just looking to have that outlet to be able to say, I've done something, I'm on that road. And you have a lot of great industry that really is looking for someone who actually has had a little bit of experience, that has worked in a SDLC environment, has kind of worked through the methodology of idea, change management, build something, ship something, produce it, and then make sure it is supported till its end of life. That is a huge piece that you don't really get in coding schools very much. You don't get those pieces. And on the other hand, there is a huge amount of local organizations, local governments, libraries, food banks, Meals on Wheels, that kind of stuff, that they're running on spreadsheets.
So
if they're lucky.
There's creating a demand on that side.
Absolutely. But they don't have the ability to work with the large vendors that really provide the R&D infrastructure for government.
Hyperledgers.
Right. What no company would be able to be self-sufficient developing wonderful, awesome distributed ledger technology for Meals on Wheels, like little distributed food banks and whatever else, or even your local library. They depend on larger infrastructures going to vendors and vendors building that infrastructure for them. And sometimes it works really well, but in a lot of regards, if the choice is between one more librarian or a kick-ass distributed ledger technology, we're going to go with one more librarian. If it's between a few more books, if it's 4 more operating hours, if it's a food bank, if it's more food in the door, one more help, they're going to spend their time on that. And so the idea basically is, if we can gather the group of people that are looking to have access to a full shop, a real development environment where they're working together as a team to hit deadlines, to develop software, to learn the intricacies that you can only learn from trying to build something and it failing, and you're looking at it at 12 in the morning and being like, oh God, why doesn't this work?
Yeah.
To that awesomeness of going production, saying something's in production, and then looking at yourself like, oh God, did we build monitoring? What are we actually monitoring?
Yeah.
That whole experience is something that is really hard to get, and it's really hard when you're just starting to come up with an idea that can get the support. So the idea here is, if we can work with local technology leaders to help shepherd along people who want to learn, to be able to start building things, and then combine that infrastructure with local governments, small local governments that are willing to sponsor, not necessarily with money, but with time and with interaction. Here's a need that we have.
And I think that ties into kind of scaling, right? These micro POCs, right? So it's a win-win for a testing ground for tech, where all of these bright minds need a spot to maybe launch some stuff, hack some things through, and then also on the public sector, or being able to kind of not pay for some of this stuff. And there's a win-win for both sides, where they can integrate and implement that. And on the tech side, you kind of see it to fruition a little bit. That gives you insight to further, move this further along. And now you can put that on a resume and have some credibility, right? When
Absolutely. In the industry,
pivot into a startup, or pivot into building that out, or you continue on the path on the public side, whether it's a library, the Meal on Wheels, and everybody's getting that experience from both sides of the public sector, learning technology and actually having the infrastructure where we can, ramp up and spur innovation, which is a great idea. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no worries.
Awesome.
No, it's great. You're totally right. And it's open source, right? So every generation builds upon it. So let's say you have a West Coast group that's built some cool stuff for a given library, and East Coast, and they all graduate, and now the industry has a number of people who have some sort of experience that they can really onboard, and maybe that development comes to us slow. maybe there's another group somewhere else in the country, in the South or the East Coast, that picks that back up and says, how can we make this even better? How can we tweak this and make this better? And now you have an ability for, if you're a small local library or nonprofit that goes, man, where do we even start? You could go to this repository that's been built by this nonprofit and go, oh, there's an open source solution that we can just kind of implement. And if we can interface with our local chapter that can help us keep this thing operational and running, that's a heck of a lot more than what people have before. So the industry gets actually experienced developers who have really worked through all the different pieces. The people themselves get that experience they need so much, and the local government gets some sort of support, and it really could grow if, like a decentralized idea in general, if you decentralize out this idea, you've now got this huge self-fulfilling snowball effect of technology that helps the people multiple ways.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm gonna have to, we'll have to follow up on this, and I think it's a good way to get, non-technical, technical people. It's going to bring in a community of individuals that can apply some kind of, wealth, human capital, right? Because a lot of it's human capital too, and then knowledge capital to really kind of have a launching pad. And I think that's kind of how I see that. That's great. So we'll have to touch base on that. But I think we're kind of coming up on time here. So just to recap, we talked about your background and how you got into blockchain, and which ultimately led to a POC, right? Identifying a problem that you saw through work and use the tools that were available, which is pretty interesting. And then we touched on Boeing, where I think we could both agree that blockchain is really going to help these enterprises with efficiency, transparency, operationally. Because you said that everything's so siloed, but I think the underlying concept there for our viewers is that can be applied anywhere. If you have a bunch of data, and specifically in this discussion, and if you have a bunch of data and a bunch of parties or stakeholders involved, blockchain could definitely be a solution, right? And kind of building up that trust amongst that ecosystem. So we kind of touched on that, which has been great. And then education and adoption, we touched on a few things. Formal education is great. Can't turn that down, but there's also other avenues and creative ways to learn. And that comes through hands-on experience, leveraging the tools that are out there. Again, a lot of all this stuff is open source, right? So anybody can jump in and start messing with it. And you said some cool key points of breaking it, building it, going through that journey of stress and, trying to have fun with it and it not working out. And finally maybe coming to fruition at some point. But I think it's getting your hands dirty, right, in the code, and using all of these new tools. And I think you can say, right, that blockchain, the infrastructure, and the resources available are there, more than enough for you to get by and build some things. Obviously, you guys are leveraging it. Other people are leveraging it, right? You would agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I mean, in the immortal words of Adventure Time, you have to suck at something before you can rule at it.
Exactly. And I think we're there. Would you say we're in the growth phase now? Obviously, this is an evolution, so it's not going to end. But the introductory period of all of these chains coming on board. I would say that Ethereum's been around a long time and Bitcoin's a long time, but I would say just maybe the last 3-4 years, right, that it's really spiked up. Applications and test cases and all that.
Right. Yeah. I think we are way out of the sucking at it phase, and things are really starting to rule. I think that the interfaces, the development tools, the experience parts of it are starting to get to that point where these things are working. They are actually deployable. They are actually in action, and they are actually working. And that is where you're going to start seeing a lot of the speed pick up. You went through kind of an ups and downs, as you do with any kind of progress. You had a lot of groups show up with a lot of big ideas that didn't necessarily pan out. There was kind of a little bit of a euphoria kind of thing going on for a little while there, and we crashed. We had to take a step back, and we had to kind of reevaluate what were the ideas that really could work. And I think you're seeing those now grow.
And I think, and I don't think a lot of people are surprised, right? These are kind of the cycles that the technology industry goes through, these boom and bust cycles, and then kind of regroup and do it again. And so it's not really a surprise. It just depends on how bad it was. But I mean, it is what it is. We made it out, and we're 2020 now. As you mentioned, the infrastructure's there, the chains are coming out, and solid teams are, bright minds are working on this. So I think we're in good hands moving forward.
Yeah, and it's awesome that groups like MouseBelt are out there pushing the technology, the education, doing a lot of that hard work that it takes to really get more great minds involved and get them up to speed and getting a lot of this stuff rolling. I mean, putting together conferences like this. So thank you, Adam. You've done a great job.
Yeah, I mean, we've had great partners, and universities are obviously committed, and then everybody that's joined us, which is what we wanted, was committed, and we think it's really important, especially during trying times. Like, we feel like we needed the community, like yourselves and everybody else, to come in and show some positivity that we're pushing forward, right? I mean, there's ups and downs right now, and it's a struggle, but what can MouseBelt do to really show that there is support, and everybody will see this through the conference of the enthusiasm and the energy that this technology is taking shape and taking form, and whether that's through investment, education, or development, we're moving along. So I just want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to join us here at Reimagine 2020. Is there anything last minute that you want to say to the students out there, anybody watching?
You can do it. Just keep working at it. If you've taken a look at the screen and you just don't get any of this, you're making progress. That is the number. When you've gotten to the point where you're like, I don't get any of this, nothing makes sense, I've tried it 8 different ways and it doesn't work, you're actually almost there. That's the best part.
And it kind of ties into, I heard Kobe say this, like the dream. The dream is that journey, right?
Right.
When it is a dream is when you finally make it, but that journey is what gets you there. That's kind of, the excitement and the ups and downs is what keeps you going and makes you stronger. So, Steve, thank you so much for giving us your time. We hope we can do this again at some point soon.
Right on. Thank you, Adam. This was fun. Let's do it again.
All right, Reimagine 2020. Hopefully you had a good time with myself and Steve. We hope to see you soon again. Thank you, guys.
Stay tuned to learn more about the state of blockchain education at major universities all around the world. Reimagine 2020.